Hello everyone, welcome to .NET Core Central. Today I'm going to continue discussion on authentication. In my last video I have walked through how to use JWT for authentication and use the NuGet packages for the JWT authentication handler and created an authentication manager which is responsible for verifying the user ID password and then create a token based on JWT NuGet packages. And if you have not watched the video, I'll provide a link up there and you can take a look. In today's video I'm going to use a custom authentication handler to do essentially the same thing. So first thing I'm going to do is, just like last time I created this JWT authentication manager, I'm going to create a custom authentication manager. So for that I'm going to create an interface called custom authentication manager. And this interface will have one method called authenticate. And just like the previous implementation, the token is going to be a string. So it will return a string. Next thing I'm going to do is create a class called custom authentication manager where I'll create the authentication token. Now just like the previous implementation, I'll keep the user ID password in a static dictionary or in-memory dictionary, and then here I'll have the similar logic as the previous one just for simplicity. And as I mentioned in the previous video, in a real life example we'll be going against some sort of database. We will use the username and password and validate against database for a valid identity, and based on that we'll create a token. So after we are done validating the username password, next thing I'm going to do is create a token. And just for the simplicity, instead of using an encrypted key, which will essentially have a valid token and we can decrypt and validate, right now I'm just going to create a GUID and have that as a token. So this is the token that I have. Now also I'll return the token. But the other thing I have to keep in mind that when I write the custom authentication handler, we'll have to validate if the token is valid or not. So for that, I have to expose some sort of dictionary which will keep the token and the username, so that based on the token, we can get the username and create identity based on that. And if the token is not available, we can just throw a unauthorized exception. So here I'm going to create a private dictionary and I'll expose a public member. I'll add this member as a part of the interface also. Next thing what I'm going to do is, after I create the token, I'll just add the token to this dictionary so that I can access it for later. As I mentioned, ideally this token will be a hash encrypted value. Also, when I add a token, I would not use an in-memory dictionary. Instead, I will use some sort of distributed cache like Redis. And when I add the token to the cache, I will of course have an expiry. Just like in the last video, I had expiry for the JWT token, which is built into the JWT token NuGet package. Similarly, for this one, we can keep an expiry. And even if we keep the token in memory, we can also keep an expiry for that, so that after a certain interval, the token is deleted. Now, for simplicity, I'm not implementing that here. Okay, now once this is created, next thing I'm going to do is create a custom authentication handler. Now, for creating a custom authentication handler, a class has to be derived from an authentication handler base class. So first I'm going to create a class and I'm going to name it as custom authentication handler. And I'm going to derive it from authentication handler base class. And the authentication handler base class is a generic class, and the T option have to be something which is derived from authentication scheme option. So what I'll do here itself is I'll create a class and now I can use this basic authentication schema option as the type for the authentication handler. Now I'm going to go ahead and implement the abstract method. The only thing we have to implement is the HandleAuthenticate async as well as the constructor. Now, apart from taking interfaces and classes which is needed for the base, I'll also inject the I custom authentication manager, because we would need the dictionary of token and username to validate the token against that list. So now once this is declared, let's implement the HandleAuthenticate async. Now in the HandleAuthenticate async, first thing we have to ensure that the authorization header is available in the request. So first we'll check that the request header contains the authorization key. And if it doesn't contain, then we are going to return a authenticate result.fail with the unauthorized message. Now once this is done, next thing we have to make sure that the authorization header actually has a value. For that, we'll take the value out. So we'll say once we verify that the authorization header is available, the next thing is to see that the authorization header starts with bearer. And I'm going to do a case insensitive comparison, and if this is also not the case, that means it is not starting with the bearer, then also we'll return authenticate result dot fail of unauthorized. Now once all this is completed, the next thing to do is to find out the token. Once we get the token from the bearer, we'll check it against the custom authentication manager to make sure it is available in the token list that we have in memory. So for that, let's first find the token now. And of course, if token is missing, we will also throw an unauthorized exception. And last but not the least is to find out the token or validate the token. So for that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a private function. And here I'm going to check if the token exists in the token list of the custom authentication manager. And if the validated token is null, then I'm just going to return authentication failure. And at this point, if I have got the validated token back, I'll have to create an identity and return a success with the created identity. So for creating identity, first thing I have to do is create claims. So in the claim, I'm saying the claim type is name, and I'm taking the validated token.value, which is nothing but the username, which I kept as a name value pair. Next, I'm going to create the identity. For the claims identity, I'm passing the scheme, authentication scheme as name. And then from this identity, I'm going to create a principal. And I'm going to pass roles as null for the time being because I'm not defining any role at this point. When we get into authorization, this role will be handy, but for now it is null. And then after it is created, I'm going to finally create the authentication ticket and return it along with the authenticate result.success. And finally, I will return the authenticate result dot success and pass the ticket. Now that my private method is created, I'm just going to have a try catch block around it, and here I'm say return validate token, passing the token. In case of any exception, I'm going to return authenticate result.fail, and for now let's just send the exception message back. I mean, ideally I'll not send, because this is authorization, I'll still send unauthorized, a very generic message here, and I will log the actual reason for the exception so that we can debug it. So now that this is also created, so we created the authentication manager and then we created the custom authentication handler. Once these are created, I'm going to go into the startup.cs and change the implementation there. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change, I don't need the JWT authentication manager anymore, so I'll just say I custom authentication manager, and since the custom authentication manager does not need any constructor, I can just pass it here. Once I do that, then I'm going to also get rid of this code of add authentication, and instead of using this mechanism of adding the JWT token, what I'm going to do is in the add authentication, I'm going to first name it as basic, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a scheme here, and in the scheme I'm going to provide the basic authentication options that I created. This is the basic authentication option which is from the authentication scheme options, and then along with that I'll pass my handler, which is custom authentication handler, and then here for the authentication scheme I'm going to pass as basic, and for the configuration options I'm just going to pass null. So let me just put it to the next line. So I did a services, the key is not needed anymore. So here I'm doing services.add authentication just like previously, but here I'm instead adding a named authentication mechanism. I'm doing a basic authentication and then adding the scheme. In the scheme I am passing my handler and the authentication option. So once this is done, I'm going to go to the name controller and I'm going to change the implementation here also. So instead of JWT, I'm going to use I custom authentication manager. And I'm going to get rid of the JWT authentication manager. And then if you remember from the last video, I had this authenticate method, which is an allow anonymous and which is based on post. And here instead of JWT, I'll have custom authentication manager.authenticate and pass the same user ID password and keep rest of the code as is. And then I'm going to run this. So now I have an incorrect header, so if I do a get, obviously I'll get a 401 unauthorized. Now next thing, I'll go to the post and make a call, and this time I'll pass appropriate user ID and password. And you can see it comes to the authenticate method. I'll just continue, and we got this GUID created. Now if I take the GUID here, go back here and just change this token with the GUID. And next let's try to send it, and now we can see it comes here and we get the array back. So it is working as expected. So just to reiterate, first we created a custom authentication manager class, and the authentication manager we used user ID password in an in-memory dictionary. This should be some sort of data store, and then in the authenticate method we just check if the username password is available in the dictionary, and if it is, then we create a new GUID. And as I mentioned, this should be ideally encrypted by a hash, and the encrypted token is the one which should be returned. returned back. And then I add the GUID into a name value collection and then return the token. And then I created a custom authentication handler using which in the HandleAuthenticate method I'm verifying if the token exists in the token store, and if it exists I'm creating a claim, an identity, and then a principal, and then I encapsulate the principal in an authentication ticket and return that, and then it becomes essentially authenticated. So this is the implementation I wanted to show. If you like this video, give me a thumbs up, and if you are getting value out of my channel, please subscribe and let me know if you have any suggestion to make it better. Thanks so much.